Warhammer has no shortage of divine beings in any of the settings. Sometimes you might need to stretch the definition of divine a bit, but you could still make a case for them being gods, like with the Catan. No connection to the warp, so no psychic powers or anything like that, but between the Necrons calling them the Star Gods and their overwhelming power even as shards, I don't think many people are going to argue that they've earned the title. You can feel free to debate the Void Dragon on whether or not he's a god, I'm just not going to be in the same room as him when you do it. Over in Fantasyland, meanwhile, there's an absolute load of gods hanging around. Gods of trickery and luck, gods of certain countries, and gods of war. As you can expect, there's a lot of that kind of god. Any kind of god you can think of you can find in the old world, and there's a solid 80% chance it can cause your untimely demise in a variety of fun and interesting ways. But that doesn't mean they aren't good folk, because in the old world of Warhammer Fantasy, most of the gods you can find are usually pretty chill. Sure, they can rip and tear until it is done, or at least tell their followers to go do that as needed, but in Warhammer, the key words of that sentence are as needed. Because believe it or not, in Warhammer Fantasy, not all of the gods are trying to kick people's balls down their throat 24/7. There's a load of different gods with different abilities, different realms of power and worship, and I thought it'd be a fun little video to talk about some of the more standout gods that aren't the Chaos Gods or Sigmar. Everyone knows those guys, you can only give them so much attention. And bonus, these gods have all been around by even the time of the old world, not just modern Warhammer Fantasy. So let's see if I can help you figure out just which god to paint your army around and scream the name of when you roll well on a charge roll. But before I start talking about Warhammer's gods, there's something I have to share with you first. Knowledge. But specifically getting knowledge. It's important after all. Your brain's just like any other part of your body. If you don't use it, you're gonna lose it. You gotta keep it in tip-top shape. And there's no better place to do so than Brilliant, the sponsor of today's video. Brilliant is the best place to learn things like math, programming, data analysis, and so much more, and it's got a few different ways that make it the best place to learn. The first is that all the lessons are filled with hands-on problems. You know what happens when you load up a lecture video? You watch it for maybe 5 minutes tops, then zone out, and suddenly you're mentally anywhere but that video. But Brilliant's got questions and problems throughout each course to keep you focused, and I may even be bold enough to say that they're enjoyable to work on. It also helps you build problem-solving skills. After all, if you're actually working through the course, you aren't just blankly staring at the video like I did every single online course I ever took. Your brain is engaged, it's doing things, and that's how Brilliant gets you learning better than anywhere else. And of course, it gets you into a daily routine that isn't an absolute chore. You only have 5 minutes a day to work on Brilliant? Totally fine, my dear fellow. Brilliant's happy to have you. Maybe you have an hour or more? Well, that's great too. As long as you have to use its courses, Brilliant is there to help you every step of the way. A good course to start for you might be exploring data visually. If you can in any way perceive of using data to help yourself out, and I would go so far as to say almost every human alive could use data to some extent or other, this course is perfect to help you get a start on the subject. And just to help you out a bit more, I've got some deals for you. Using my link in the description and pinned comment, you can get not only 30 days of Brilliant as a free trial, but 20% off your annual plan. That's http://brilliant.org/PancreasNoWork for both a 30 days free trial and 20% off the annual plan. You never need to stop learning, so why don't you try Brilliant to learn in the best way possible. Now then, let's look at some of the gods that won't turn you into a chaos spawn for fun. As a heads up, this won't be particularly organized when it comes to talking about each god. All of the gods I'm talking about in the video are chosen because they belong to the same group of gods, but when it comes to each of them, I'm just gonna kinda start talking until I run out of stuff to talk about. While I won't be talking about Sigmar, I think it's only fair to start with the same god that Sigmar worshipped. Ulric. Ulric is known as the Winter Wolf, as well as a number of other things almost all relating back to wolves that make you wonder if he's not going to show up in a Space Wolf book at some point or other in the future. As you can expect from the name Winter Wolf, he's a god of winter and wolves, as well as a prominent war god among humanity, especially the Empire. Initially, Ulric was the chief god of the Empire of Man, or at least far more worshipped than he is now. Indeed, it was his direct blessing of Sigmar when he was facing the Teutogens tribe that allowed Sigmar to annex them into his own faction, and as I said, Ulric was the god Sigmar prayed to. The history of his worship is a bit interesting though, as he may have at one point been a conjoined god alongside his fellow deities Taal and Rhya. More on that when we come to them though. Either way, by Sigmar's time, he was the chief god, the one who was the driving force behind the then man-emperor of the realm. Of course, even before he got a whole setting named after him, you've probably noticed that Sigmar ended up stealing the show from Ulric not too long after the Empire was formed. Sigmarite worship eventually came to eclipse that of Ulric, with him becoming the chief god of the Empire he formed. Ulric never went away though, by no means did he. In even the earliest tellings, Ulric was the one who gave Sigmar his divinity, crowning him with it while other gods watched on. Ulric may have been sidelined, but he's still a powerful deity. His main remaining bastion of worship, Middenland, would certainly agree with this. The cult of Ulric is strongest there, and in particular the city of Middenheim itself. As a general rule of thumb, the more northern provinces of the Empire tend to have more Ulric worshippers, since the winters are harsher and that is Ulric's domain. Ulric also being a war god, it's nice to have someone direct like that to pray to when the Norskins come knocking. These people don't necessarily look down on those who worship Sigmar. After all, even if they prefer Ulric, there's not a man alive in the Empire who doesn't at least respect Sigmar. But every now and then, things do get a little bit heated. Priests of their respective gods tend to butt heads, frequently literally, as both Sigmar and Ulric are war gods who command their followers and especially priests to be at least somewhat proficient in battle. Sometimes this starts and ends at two old veterans beating each other up over which of their really cool gods is actually the coolest. Sometimes this escalates into just a slight bit of a religious civil war in the Empire. This is still Warhammer after all, things tend to be resolved with violence at least as often as not. Further driving conflict between the two is the political situation of the Empire. The leader of the cult of Ulric, the Ulric, has their own vote when it comes to electing the next emperor, giving them potent political power in addition to being the cult of a war god that doesn't mind showing you just how warlike Ulric can be. Of course, the cult of Sigmar gets 3 votes, so there's certainly some hurt feelings to be had. Ulricans calling for the two cults to have even more political power is by no means uncommon. Depending on which god you think is preferable to worship, you may find that this is either a valid call for religious equality or the losing side being bitter people like the other guy more than their patron. In my personal opinion, I think the Ulricans just need to get over themselves. Sorry you lost the high school popularity contest, but not everyone can be the prom king. All that being said though, the cults of Ulric and Sigmar are generally on no worse than neutral terms, even if they do try and one-up the other. You'll find that even the most devout Sigmarites will throw up a prayer to Ulric when the battle lines are drawn and it's time to face the hordes of chaos of the vampire counts. And given that at the very least Ulric blessed Sigmar when he was immortal, there isn't an Ulrican who doesn't appreciate the thought of doing right by Sigmar's name and deeds if nothing else. These different cults know that in spite of their different preferences of worship, both of their patrons are the sworn enemies of the things that lurk in the darkness of the world. When push comes to shove, an Ulrican and Sigmarite warrior priest would fight side by side as if they were brothers, because against undead, chaos, and more, their patron gods are sometimes all they have to throw back the darkness. If Saltspire can work with a wood elf without exploding, then Sigmar and Ulric's worshippers can put aside their differences for just a moment just fine. Ulric generally values bravery and a willingness to stand up to the darkness of the world. Not exactly the most unique war god stuff, but pretty necessary in the world of Warhammer fantasy. He's not Khorne, he doesn't expect you to throw yourself against 50 chaos giants at once in order to get his attention, but if you can feasibly win and your attention isn't best spent elsewhere, you shouldn't back down from a fight. He doesn't demand constant bloodshed, but if there is a righteous fight to be had and you can feasibly win, you'd better be there swinging. Also, you'd best not start talking shit, because Ulric will fully expect you to back it up, as shown from Sigmar's fight against the leader of the Tautogens. Wolves are also his most sacred animal, and a sure sign that Ulric has his eyes on you. Depending on the situation, the wolves may be a good or bad sign. A lone wolf or a pack of them wandering in the winter is generally a sign of his favor, since that's his sacred animal and his sacred element. That doesn't mean that you aren't about to be torn apart by wolves. I mean, they're still wolves, but that'll just be because they're hungry, not because Ulric hates you. A mutated wolf or something like that can be Ulric warning you that, hey, there's some chaos problems nearby. Probably beastmen, given that he's most prominently worshipped in Middenland, and Middenland is like 80% beastmen by population. Some minor theological facts to end off on: the Ulricsburg Plateau that Middenheim is built upon was said to be created by Ulric's elder brother and fellow god Taal. Ulric was feeling down that Taal had the whole world to call his own, but Ulric didn't have any realm to just himself. Not jealous, Ulric's above that, but just down in the dumps, feeling a little bit left out. So Ulric asked Taal for a place he could call his own, and Taal gave him a massive mountain surrounded by forests, and Ulric was pretty happy with that. Either he, Taal, or both of them flattened it with their big meaty god fists, and eventually humans decided it was as good a place to set up shop on as any. Within his great temple atop of it rests the Flame of Ulric. It's like the Flame of Assyrian, but wolfier. It has 2 main mystical properties. One is that no true follower of Ulric will be burned by it. Sigmar himself proved this when he got tossed into it and came out literally howling like a wolf. Magnus the Pious proved it when the Ulric of the time thought it'd be a good idea to say that Sigmar worship was outright heretical. Magnus walked up to it, said if he was a heretic he would come out burned, and he came back out perfectly fine. Suck it, you stuck-up Middenlanders. The second major thing it has going for it is that it's said that while while it still burns, Middenheim will never fall. And I don't want to come across as a fanatic, but I'm just saying, Middenheim was holding out pretty alright in the end times until Teclis came along and ripped the fire from where it stood before he shoved it into Tyrion. It fell pretty quickly after that, so maybe that theory held some weight. For his part, Ulric possessed a dude and called Teclis a real prick for doing that, but there wasn't much left for him to do by that point. And one final note to end on, Ulric has werewolf followers. They're called the Children of Ulric, and yeah, they're werewolves. Unfortunately, their main appearance, at least as far as I know, was in a Gotrek and Felix story. An evil wizard stole one's body before Felix managed to kill him with a special magical dagger, and his daughter was slain by an equally mystical and supernatural method known as Gotrek Gurnison. But hey, werewolves are cool. Hopefully there's a few more out there, and Gotrek didn't single-handedly end Ulric's mortal bloodline. Up next, since I mentioned him before, will be Taal and his wife Rhya. They're pretty similar in what they are, so they have to share a spot. And if you think that's being reductive of them, consider that they share a cult as well. Taal is also one of the gods you might have heard about even if you aren't super familiar with Warhammer Fantasy and its gods, since Marcus Kruber likes to scream Taal's name at every given opportunity. Taal and Rhya are both nature gods, and indeed while they do have their own worshippers, they're frequently worshipped in a combined fashion in the cult of Taal and Rhya. In ancient times there were likely one single combined god, Ishernos. In summer and winter, Ishernos had a male face, and in spring and fall, a female face. Why exactly they separated isn't clear, although it's been stated that in the minds of mortals, the two different faces came to be seen as two distinct but related gods. Given how belief works in Warhammer, this might have caused Ishernos to become Taal and Rhya, as the beliefs of mortals changed the nature of the god to become gods. Some of their oldest symbols was that weird circle triangle thing that I am told is called a Triskeles, which is where the belief that Ulric was once a part of this combined deity comes from. Taal is the god of wild nature, the untamed forests and rivers that dot the land. If you're somewhere where the GPS just isn't gonna work, you're in Taal's territory. Savage beasts and the earth itself are his domain, because if you think about it, the dirt and rock beneath our feet is just as much a part of nature as the trees and grass are. Good old savage berserker fury can be part of his domain, since if nothing else, Kruber is a living battering ram, and Taal hasn't seen fit to strike him down yet, but he's generally far more passive of a god. At least passive in the sense of getting enjoyment out of his duties. To me, he seems to be a pretty well done example of nature not caring if you live or die. The wood elves and the forest spirits may say that, oh, we simply kill you because it is nature, but it seems just a little bit like they enjoy doing it. Dryka seems to take a lot of pleasure out of ripping people apart, I'm just saying. If you get ripped apart by a lion or a bear, meanwhile, yeah, that could in part be Taal's doing, but he didn't do it just to have fun or because he hates you in particular for walking through a forest. That's just what nature does. It's the circle of life and the food chain and all that, not he's getting pleasure out of the act of killing people who take a walk through the woods at night. As a result, Taal's worshippers are generally those who make use of nature in a way that brings to mind the different kinds of deodorant for men. Hunters, trappers, tanners, lumberjacks. If you go out there and wrestle a bear with your own two hands to feed and clothe the family, you probably pay Taal at least lip service. Rhya, by comparison, is the god of the land civilization has already tamed. Whereas Taal sends a bear to obliterate some poor dude walking down an unmapped trail, Rhya sends a nice gentle rain to water your crops and let the rainbow shine. She's a goddess of fertility, so aside from tending to crops, a great way to honor her is to have a metric ton of children. In fact, surprisingly enough, she's actually a love goddess. Love? In my Warhammer? More likely than you think. Her and her followers actually despise Slaanesh because of this. In their mind, there's a difference between a good bounty and excess. Having extra crops and using them to feed the hungry or prepare for hard times is what Rhya wants. Gorging yourself on it is what Slaanesh wants. Similarly, having a loving relationship with your partner is what Rhya wants, while masturbating with poison ivy around your hands, feet, and genitals is what Slaanesh wants. You're welcome for that lovely image, by the way. Also, the plant, not the DC character, you scum. Together they form the entirety of what can be considered natural, from agrarian lifestyles to living off the lands like a hunter-gatherer. It should be noted that while Rhya is certainly more gentle than Taal, and Taal isn't going to go out of his way to kill you, neither are particularly merciful towards those that wrong them. There is a goddess of mercy, but we aren't talking about her yet, and either way, it isn't Rhya. If you go around polluting the forest or punching children in the face, Taal and Rhya will be having words with you, and those words will probably sound like angry bears. Or a pack of wolves, because remember, Ulric is Taal's brother. No reason to assume pissing one of them off won't piss off the other one too. When they give their followers signs of what's to come, it's usually in either the most tree-hugging ways you can think of, or something fittingly Warhammer-esque. If things are going well, the sun will shine after a gentle shower and a lovely rainbow will fill the the air if Rhya is happy. If Taal's in a good mood, your arrow will fly true and you will have gotten the perfect kill, the deer whose meat and pelt will be the envy of all the other hunters. If things are not going well, the fields will look like they're covered in blood and the trees will have faces, the animals will be acting all weird and wrong and looking like crimes against nature. Although I have this image in my mind of a rabbit just standing up, looking someone dead in the eyes and going, "Hey man, things aren't great right now." Not that funny, I guess, the thought just makes me kinda chuckle. Their main area of worship is of course Land, right in the middle of the Empire. The province is named after Taal, in fact, just with the L and the second A switching places. As with Ulric though, you can find worshippers of Taal and Rhya across the Empire, wherever there's farmers and hunters. While they're naturally subservient to Sigmar, as all other gods in the Empire are, Taal and Rhya's cults generally don't have the same rivalry with other gods that Sigmar and Ulric's cult do between the two of them. There is some dispute over who exactly is the king of the gods, as Taal's worshippers say it's Taal, while Ulric's followers say that it's the Winter Wolf, but these disputes never really go anywhere worth worrying about. It's probably mostly just drunken barroom talk. According to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay's 4th edition core rules, worship of Rhya may or may not be dying out. There's not much in the way of holy books, temples, or relics to her, and even her worshippers don't do much to dispute the claim. That being said, they might just not care to, and given that her and Taal are often combined into one cult, it may also just be that her worshippers are slowly moving back to only having the combined cult of Taal and Rhya. Why have the paperwork of 3 cults when you can just have one big cult? Overall, not too much left to discuss about them, so let's move on to their kid. Manann is the god of the sea. Taal may have rivers, but Manann's domain is the entire ocean. If you for whatever reason need to travel open water, be you a fisherman, merchant ship, or even just sailing for fun, you will be paying respects to Manann. What paying respects to Manann involves is actually kind of funny, truth be told, and reads like exactly the sort of thing superstitious sailors in the Middle Ages would believe. The first catch of the day goes to him, so you'd best either sacrifice it or release it back into the sea. Never harm an albatross, because those are his sacred animal. Don't whistle or swear at the sea or his holy grounds. Aside from there being a lot of overlap between places Manann considers holy and the sea, that one is probably the most often broken of his tenets. Swearing like a sailor is a saying for a reason, after all. Give a silver and a fish to every temple of his you approach, although that one may just be priest of his fleecing you for money and food. And hunt down the servants of Stromfels wherever you see them. Stromfels is Manann but a complete dickhead for reference, more on him eventually. Aside from sailors, any city built on a coastal region is bound to be dotted in temples to Manann and full of his worshippers. Hurricanes aren't a problem exclusive to the deep ocean, so it's best to keep Manann's favor in mind if you can look across the horizon and see nothing but blue. Naturally, Marienburg is the chief location of his cult, since its entire society is built upon being the ocean trading capital of the old world. The Empire proper doesn't have too many worshippers of his since it's largely landlocked, but you can find a couple of his temples dotted across its lands. His attitude is that of any given characterization of the ocean you've ever read about. He can be cruel and ferocious, battering entire fleets with hurricanes until everyone's been sent straight to a watery grave. But he can also be a pretty happy-go-lucky, supportive god, giving you the sort of sea breeze and warm air that a Californian breach can only dream of, and sending you straight back to your home port without any issues. At the end of the day, his priests respect him above all others, and when out at sea, pretty much will everyone find themselves at least briefly converting to Manann worship, but no one really loves him like they do Sigmar or Ulric. For all the good he can do, there's plenty of bad he does as well, and it's probably hard to love someone who can at any moment send tidal waves to obliterate your entire home. For some minor myths, he apparently fell in love with the elven god Lilith, but she lives on the moon that isn't pure evil, so he can never reach her. Him sending out tidal waves sometimes is him being bitter he can't get his elven waifu, which is fair and entirely reasonable if you ask me. As he breathes in and out, it's his breath that is said to cause the tides around the world. And one instance of the origin of the Skaven also involves him, where he cursed shipwreck survivors who resorted to cannibalism by devolving them into rat people. While the doom of Kavzar origin tale of the Skaven is pretty much outright confirmed to be canon, this one isn't technically mutually exclusive with that one. There's theoretically no reason that this couldn't have happened before that one guy built the bell on top of the Tower of Babel on Kavzar and doomed the entire city. If this is the case, thank you Manann for ruining everything forever. What was supposed to be punishment for a couple of cannibals turned into a race of beings that nuked the moon apart. He can give people signs and omens in a few ways, most of them involving dreams and visions of things like storms, shipwrecks, ships that aren't wrecked, and general ocean vibes. Also albatrosses. An albatross is always considered an omen of Manann, but the funny thing is, no one can say if it's a good or a bad omen. Manann has sent you an omen, certainly, but who knows what kind of omen? This, I imagine, is also one of the reasons no one loves Manann. He just sends a bird at you and it's up to you to figure out if that's a good or a bad thing. A dead one is always a bad sign, though. And now, the god Morr. Morr is the god of the dead, death, prophecy, and dreams. There's a bit of an immediate canon conflict with Morr because in a Warhammer Fantasy 2nd Edition supplement, he was said to only be the god of the dead, not death. But in the Warhammer Fantasy 4th Edition core rulebook, Morr is stated to be the god of both. So let's just go for the more recent one and say he's the god of death and the dead. Morr isn't a terribly complex god with an excess of lore, at least compared to Sigmar or Ulric, but you can infer some things about him from what is known. What is known is that the Gardens of Morr is the realm of the dead, and he keeps the dead safe from evildoers like Chaos or Necromancers. His priests even come out in force during nights like Geheimnisnacht and Hexensnacht in order to keep both the resting dead safe and put the living dead back in the ground. So if you follow me, here's what I think we can make of Morr. Morr's priests, temples, and crypts are generally dull gray buildings with little in the way of decoration or art. We can assume therefore that Morr is a rather stoic god, fitting for someone who guards the dead. Rich or poor, everyone is equal in the afterlife, so Morr has no reason to have any fine trappings or anything like that. We can also assume that he's a generally good guy. There are no rites to Morr that involve killing people, and the only people they hunt are necromancers and chaos followers actively dicking with the dead. While he is the god of death, he isn't an evil one. He's just doing his job. We can also assume that he's fairly powerful. While he's not exactly a prevalent god in the lore, Morr's job is guarding the souls of the dead from necromancers and worse. And while the existence of vampires and necromancers shows he isn't perfect, it's worth considering two things. First off is that in this setting, much of necromancy isn't actually reanimating the dead, but just puppeting their corpses. The soul is still within Morr's garden, the body is just jerking around and trying to eat Everlanders. The second thing is that there's a whole lot of dead people in Warhammer. It's a war game setting. There's going to be a lot of people dying pretty frequently. So just through the sheer amount of people he has to watch over, some of them are going to end up falling through the cracks. There's untold billions of people he has to keep safe for all time. Of course he isn't perfect, but he's seemingly managed to prevent large-scale breaches into his garden as well as general soul thievery. Given all that, I'd be willing to bet that while Morr isn't a very combative god, he's certainly not going to be going on crusades against the various evils of the world. Anyone would do well to not grab his attention. In this setting, the dead don't rest easy without protection, and Morr seems to be doing quite well at keeping his charges safe. Now, the end times might make you think I'm spewing garbage because Nagash ate him, but I would argue that's not so. Nagash is the dude who invented necromancy, the one who harnessed the entire wind of death to further his plans. He is not the average person. He's not even something like a chaos lord. He is death. Literally, when he bound the wind of death to himself, he basically became death. That's something I imagine Morr would have a tough time dealing with, and I don't blame him for it or consider him weak for falling in this manner. And if we really want to get technical with it, Nagash actually ate the Nehekaran god of the dead, Usirian. Morr disappeared at the same time, which lends credence to the theory that the various human gods of Warhammer Fantasy are all either the same god in different guises or inherently linked. If the former, then Nagash did still end up killing Morr, even if I don't fault him for it. But if the latter is true, it's not even Morr's fault that he died. Dude might have just been strolling through his garden, then suddenly vanished. Either way, Morr's a good guy, and you'd best pay your respects. He's going to be watching your soul for all eternity, protecting you from all kinds of threats. The least you can do is thank him for his service. These 5 gods make up what's known in the Empire as the Old Gods, the gods that have always been worshipped to some degree or other in the Empire of Man, and who many consider to be the Empire's true patron deities alongside Sigmar. And if you don't mind, I have a story for you all of how these beings reacted to the Great Catastrophe and the coming of chaos. In the time before the Empire, and potentially even before the elves and dwarfs had their mighty empires, the old gods strode the world as we do. Ulric in particular, having not yet been gifted the Faustschlag in what would become Middenheim, liked to walk around and slaughter scary things. Present in many of these tales was his cousin Ranald, who we'll get to later. Ranald was a trickster, and together they had a number of great journeys, but their last was to be the most important for both their relationship and the very world itself. On this final journey, Ranald and Ulric ventured north to the top of the world. There they saw something of utmost horror, what we know as the northern portal to the realm of chaos, left behind after the Old One's great gates exploded. It was a great crack in the sky, a hole that led to countless demons and their foul patron gods. Ulric and Ranald knew that this unchecked would be the doom of all that was, and Ulric rushed to hold close the rift. He bade Ranald to run and tell their fellow gods of what was found here so that they may face this threat together. Ranald promptly gave him a salute, shit his pants, and ran as far away as he possibly could to hide in a corner, because he looked into the void, and when it looked back, he did not like what he saw. So Ulric sat at the northern pole of the world, holding this rift shut, and he did this not for a day, not for a week, nor a month or even a year. Ulric, mad lad he is, sat holding this portal for a millennia straight, plus another year for good measure. Eventually, he realized that Ranald was being a little bit of a bitch and was not coming back with reinforcements, so he left the rift as he could no longer keep it shut. When Ulric returned, aside from swearing he'd never deal with tricksters like Ranald again, he told his fellow gods of what he saw. And his fellow gods almost universally had some of the stupidest possible responses ever. Taal just straight up didn't believe that there could be another realm beyond that of the Warhammer world. He was told of a horrible realm of demons and more that could threaten his entire reality, and all he had to say on that was, "What's your source?" Manann, in turn, just didn't care. Ulric told him that there was a threat, and instead of not believing him, he just said, "I missed the part where that's my problem. It's a problem for the landlubbers, not me hardy crew of mighty albatrosses." Manann was straight up pirate maxing. He's too based and first mate celled to care about the land. God, I hate everything that just left my mouth. Morr believed Ulric, but also didn't do anything. He thought Ulric could handle this all by his lonesome. Which is sweet and supportive of him and all, but also, if he could have handled it, Ulric probably wouldn't have gone to the rest of you for help, so maybe Morr isn't as competent as I thought he was. Ranald was already out, so Ulric didn't even bother, and I couldn't find anything about what he said to Rhya and what she thought. She was presumably too busy getting halflings to fuck or something, I don't know. Isha stole all the nature goddess badass for herself, so Rhya's just left with being a loving mother, I guess. Finally, he pleaded with the goddess Verena, a goddess of wisdom and magic, and most importantly, the basic common sense to know that demons are a problem for everyone, not just those in the immediate vicinity of the North Pole. She said that if no one else was going to help, she would, and went with Ulric to fight the demons pouring into the world. This left Morr feeling like a bit of a little bitch, but unlike Ranald, he actually rallied the other gods alongside him and followed his wife and Ulric to the north. The fighting took a while, with the demons eventually being driven back, but the rift remaining open. Left unsaid is whether or not they saw Grimnir walk into the realm of chaos swearing about beards and axes. Now, obviously this conflicts with other events of the Great Catastrophe, such as the elves and lizardmen creating the Great Vortex and holding back the demons. But remember, this is a religious myth based on the origins of chaos and their own gods. It isn't meant to be taken as fact, it's a sort of creation story. There's also no reason to believe these gods didn't act against Chaos's initial incursion. This is just the Empire's interpretation of what was happening, not something we as the reader need to take as absolute fact. Also, I would simply like to say that once again, Warhammer Fantasy absolutely mogs 40k in this aspect. 40k says everything is canon, not everything is true, and then proceeds to use that excuse to write an Alpha Legion novel about how, haha, I am Alfarius, everything I say is a lie, this entire book is gonna end with the punchline of actually I tricked you all the whole time, nothing in this book is true, aren't we clever? Fantasy, meanwhile, takes this approach and gives you an entire creation myth that by no means do you need to take as written fact of what happens, because it also gives you several other myths about the exact same event. But with that, it's occurred to me this script is getting a little bit long. There are a whole lot of gods left to cover, and to further complicate matters, when we get to the elves, they're both fantasy and 40k gods. Lovely. So for the time being, let's end matters here. But I'll talk about the rest later. I'll make it its own little series. The Gods of Warhammer, for all those gods that don't quite warrant a full video, but do still deserve some love. Like Morr. I like Morr. Give your respects to Morr. We need more Morr in Warhammer. Except Ulric. Ulric might get his own video one day too, because he's Ulric. He's a real one like that. So for now, I hope you've enjoyed this tale of the old gods. The gods mankind worshipped before new ones came along, and one mortal man rose to become the mightiest of them all. You know what the best part about this thing being a series is? I could just title it Gods of Warhammer each time. I'm going to talk about elf gods eventually, and half those guys are also in 40k. I'm not lying when I just title it Warhammer. You can also just call fantasy Warhammer. It's a perfectly valid use of the name. It's not my fault that most people associate the word Warhammer with 40k and might make an assumption about the video based on the title. No lies have been told by me. I can only hope that I trick thousands of people into going, wow, more 40k gods, only for everyone to get jump scared by Warhammer Fantasy. As always, thank you to my wonderful channel members. You are the old gods to my empire of man, the bedrock upon which all later faith was built upon. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Alright, I'm jumping a bit ahead with the gods for another video in this series for the end joke here, but I really think that the Idoneth not being able to bring back Mythlan is the ultimate skill issue on either their part or Mythlan's. If it's their skill issue, it's because they live in a setting where belief can shape reality, and yet they can't just bring Mythlan back to life. Just believe harder, you stupid idiots. Or it could be Manann's fault. Seriously, man, Cain's been stated to be able to come back to life, and would have by now if it weren't for Morathi stealing the power of the daughters of Cain's belief to ascend to godhood herself. Kinda sad, Manann, showing a real lack of effort and motivation on your part. You know what though, maybe this is somehow Teclis's fault. When they were drawing souls out of Slaanesh, he could have grabbed a god, but instead he grabbed random elf souls that he decided he was going to kill later on anyways. Actual Arctic room temperature IQ if that was the case. Dumb elven twink. He's lucky he's never met me or he'd end up pregnant.